farcela, resistere ancora un poco, dal titolo Come pensare teologicamente la nostra pratica. Michel de Certeau e la teologia pratica. Ci sarà offerto da Christian Bauer, che è stato professore di teologia pastorale e omiletica presso l'Università di Innsbruck e adesso lavora all'Università di Münster. Dal 2019 è presidente della Società dei Teologi Pastorali di Germania, Austria, Svizzera e Paesi Bassi, e nel 2017 insieme a Marco Sorace ha pubblicato la prima antologia teologica in lingua tedesca su Michel de Certeau. Quindi ci disponiamo ad ascoltarlo e poi avremo ancora un breve spazio di dibattito e poi il pranzo.
So first of all, a big thank you for your kind invitation and for this wonderful conference. In English, there's the wonderful saying, the last one takes the devil. So I hope there is still some energy in the conference and in this aula magna filled with systematic theologians and historians. Let me start with a kind of friendly provocation. Michel de Certeau seems to be a hidden practical theologian, or to use the words of Gregoriana, an anonymous practical theologian. Practical theology explores the in-between. Margit yesterday mentioned it, the entre-deux, of a wide range of various archives of discourse and fields of practices. Its theological creativity emerges precisely from this characteristic difference. Michel de Certeau traveled the same land, combining a huge variety of discourses and practices in the archives of intellectual production and on the fields of social imagination. He explored the in-between, the entre-deux, of the archives of early modern Christian mysticism, and at the same time, the fields of late modern human existence. Both early modern discourses and late modern practices shape the outlines of his very intellectual profile. His two later masterpieces, Art de faire and La Fable Mystique, both were mentioned several times, represent the potential creativity of this discursive difference. A difference that also is typical for practical theology. Here, two practical discourse of Praxistheorie meet discursive practices of Theoriepraxis. The explorative and at the same time critical approach of practical theology combines thousands of small stories of everyday life with the great master narratives of the gospel. All this is about Christian contemporaneity. And Michel de Certeau was a master of Christian contemporaneity. Being a true Jesuit on the one hand and a compassionate contemporary on the other, he was at home in the betwixt and between, queering and crossing fascinating worlds of different peoples and places. In my following reflections, I will focus on the post-68 Certeau during the late 1970s, tracing his footprints of those days in 3 steps, to then link them with more recent discourses for actualization. Firstly, a rereading of a little text from 1977 about a seminar held at the University Parisette à Jussieu, showing the entire Certeau in a nutshell. Secondly, a reflection on 3 very useful distinctions of Michel de Certeau, like watchers and wanderers, strategies and tactics, tours and maps. And thirdly, it's only a short part, I will attempt to shape his heterological approach to mystical discourse and everyday practices as a multifarious discourse on the other. All these things are, even not exclusively, but also necessary for doing practical theology. So, my first step. Comment penser notre pratique? How to think our practice? Michel de Certeau raises this methodologically crucial question in a wonderful, small, more hidden than published text, first printed in the year 1977. Qu'est-ce qu'un séminaire? What is a seminar? By rethinking academic practices epistemically, this article turns the everyday, or better, every second week practice of a seminar into a source of epistemological creativity. Doing theory by doing seminaries, or more precisely, doing epistemology. That's why this small but important article is more than a mere author-ethnographic self-observation of an academic teacher, focused on methodology. It is Michel de Certeau in a nutshell, introducing us into his own style of thinking. I quote, "A seminar is a common research laboratory, un laboratoire commun, that allows each of its participants to express their own insights. It is as if each person brought the dictionary of his or her materials, experiments, and ideas, and as if that laboratory enabled them to form sentences from this vocabulary. This place of exchange that always creates new beginnings, French, échanger instauratrice, could be compared to what is called cactoire, the plural laboratory of a weekly rendezvous on the big square of a city, where passers-by meet to produce a communal language and a personal discourse at the same time." End of quotation. The seminar as a crowded urban square, an academic cactoire where, interwoven into a network of other social places, a communal production of meaning may take place. This production is capable of transforming society by the subversive micro-resistance of late modern arts of living. This was Certeau's main focus in the late 70s when he taught cultural anthropology at the 7th University of Paris in Jussieu. He taught at the, I quote, Cactoire de Paris from 1972 until 1978, which met brilliantly with his research project on contemporary cultural practices in France, conducted in the years 1974 till 1977. In this empirical teamwork project, Certeau used methods of quantitative and qualitative social research in a very unorthodox way, focusing on participant observation of everyday life at popular places like, for example, the neighborhood La Croix-Rousse à Lyon, a former working-class district which is a fancy artist and hipster quarter today. This ethnographical approach might brought to light the, I quote, creative heterogeneity of social practices, reusings, repurposings, reappropriations of the urban space. This Certeau dispersed tactical and tinkering creativity, which turned simple powerless consumers into powerful co-producing prosumers, inspired his most famous book, Practices of Everyday Life, French Art de Faire. This book established his international fame as one of the founding fathers of cultural studies. I quote, "People reappropriate the space. They use a multitude of tactics. We want to bring light to the clandestine forms taken by this creativity of groups and individuals. These procedures of consumers compose the network of an anti-discipline. And he writes this some years after the book of Michel Foucault. One can follow the swarming activity of these procedures, still Certeau, that far from being regulated by panoptic administration, have insinuated themselves into the networks of surveillance. I would like to trace few of these multiform, resistant, tricky, and stubborn procedures that elude discipline without being outside the field in which it is exercised. End of quotation. For its participants, Certeau's seminar at Paris 7 was the same. An unforgettable experience of subversive micropolitics of knowledge. An introduction into a tactical use of theories within the strategies of a predominant discourse. François Doss reports that there was a wind of freedom blowing in these seminars. And Lucia remembers, everything took place in a climate of intellectual liberty. No orthodoxy dominated, no dogma was imposed. The only implicit but strong rule was the desire of elucidation and an interest of exploring the concrete life. In miraculous moments, an air of intelligence floated through our works, a form of serenity which I never experienced in an institution of knowledge before. Everybody was welcomed with the same intensity of listening. This didactic performativity is remarkable. To put it into recent ecclesial terms, no epistemic clericalism, in the sense of the professor knows everything, he or she teaches without learning, but a kind of synodal epistemics, in the sense of a shared way, a synodos, of equal searchers and learners. Concerning this epistemic form of a synodal style of doing cultural anthropology, Certeau characterized his approach as zigzag, oscillating between the history of what we have already done and the utopia of what is still to be done. Both of these also characterize practical theology. It also oscillates between practical field research and discursive archive distance, or, as Certeau puts it in What is a Seminar? In our research group, everyone's actual field practices take place outside the University Paris 7. In the university, however, encounters can take place regularly that are able to create a distance, un écart, in relation to the different places from which we come and where we work. In other words, the seminar can produce ways of distancing ourselves from our tasks and, at the same time, ways of returning to them in a changed manner, autrement. Cultural anthropology, as well as practical theology, require both thick description and critical distance, because, I quote, "This play of places and about places opens up a critical space. This has a twofold condition of its own possibility. A, the practice of the group must be determined by the elaboration of its external contacts, that's the ethnographic part. B, but it also has the function of a critical distance. The discourses of the group are characterized by the fact that they are separated from the practices that we analyze with each other. And that is the theory part." End of quotation. There is only a gradual difference between the production of knowledge at universities and in society. Long before the sociological discourse discovered and conceived practice theories, Certeau aimed to, I quote, give theoretical shape to everyday practices. Comment penser notre pratique? That's why he criticized the separation of academic theory at the one and social practices on the other side. It's maybe close to your refusion of the separation of mystical discourse and theological discourse. Certeau aimed to, I quote, at the very same time, from 1975 until 1977, Bruno Latour and Steve Woolger conducted their groundbreaking field research in a Californian laboratory by which they showed the constitutive influence of social practices on scientific work. 1979, they published their results in Laboratory Life, The Construction of Scientific Facts. In order to understand this important book, one can read Certeau's following lines from qu'un séminaire. The practices of our analysis leave behind the artificial boundary between the practices of a seminar and practices that are excluded from it, like eating, drinking, arguing from personal history behind the research, experiencing a local network in which an investigation is inscribed, and so on. They enable a reciprocal elucidation of our ways of studying and the ways of practice that we study. Theoretical work must attack the division between what academic is and what not. This project implies a play in a variety of locations. The periodic climb up of a university staircase represents only one punctuation in the text of our social activities. My second step, Certeau's toolbox. Michel de Certeau was a master of Ignatian dialectics, based on very useful distinctions, not only for the spiritual life, but also for theological research. Some of his theoretical distinctions are perfect tools for doing practical theology. I just single out 3 of them, which are connected to his text on the seminar. First, strategies and tactics. Certeau distinguishes strategies from tactics. I already mentioned it. In qu'un séminaire, he writes, I have called tactics ways of subverting the rules imposed by a dominant system. I distinguish them from strategies that are determined by the ability to form an autonomous locus of power. Our concern was to analyze these tactics. They constitute the vast majority of social practices. The creativity of consumers who are unrecognized poets and artists. The relationship of this type of pranking to the system within which it develops. The function of these tactics, which can be seen as an operational articulation between systems and bodies. All these questions form the babel of voices, le brouhaha, of our cactuar. So I skip a little, you know about these distinctions, I'm quite sure, to be in time at the end. I just want to show you a book of a German cultural theorist, because Michel de Certeau is very keen on these reappropriations that create a space propre without creating a safe and stable property. Academic solidarities with these practices constitute a kind of complicity. And the German cultural theorist Gesa Ziemer turned this into a fascinating concept, Komplizenschaft. Cultural anthropology and practical theology can be discursive allies of subaltern and marginalized tactics. Even more, in a kind of performative experience of discourse, Certeau's own seminar, as altered and decentered as it was forced to act tactically with respect to powerful and predominant discursive strategies in the French academic topography. I quote, "The seminar does not constitute a place of its own, un lieu propre. The seminar journeys outside Parisette, and so we find ourselves in various places. These escapes not only allow more concrete experiences and freer exchanges, they also break the seductive fiction of a place of one's own, a lieu propre." From Parisette to New York. Next station, World Trade Center. The 110th floor was a place where Michel de Certeau's distinction of strategies and tactics became concrete in two types of looking down at the skyscrapers and the streets of Manhattan. This fascinating view creates a certain type of knowledge. Certeau asks, to what erotics of knowledge does the ecstasy of reading such a cosmos belong? I wonder what is the source of this pleasure of seeing the whole, of looking down. When one goes up there, he leaves behind the mass. His elevation transfigures him into a voyeur, a city watcher from above. It transforms the world into a text that lies before one's eyes. It allows one to be a solar eye, looking down like a god. End of quotation. This totalizing, god-like, top-down view of an, I quote, all-seeing power is embodied by Le Corbusier's divine hand of modern architecture. But there is an alternative, the bottom-up view of everyday urban practices. Certeau. The ordinary practitioners of the city live down below. They are walkers, mystically spoken, Wandersmänner or Wandersfrauen, whose bodies follow the urban text, the right without being able to read it. The networks of these writings compose a manifold story shaped out of the fragments of trajectories and alterations of spaces. So at the end, there are two ways of doing cultural anthropology and doing theology or practical theology, in the way of a watcher from above or of a wanderer below in the streets. Il y a deux possibilités, le voyeur ou le voyageur. It's only two letters which mark a big difference. And just as a kind of shift into another discourse, into the urbanist discourse of 20th century in US, Louis Mumford and Jane Jacobs, they stand for this different type of looking at a city, from below and from above, or like Richard Sennett puts it in the French distinction of ville and cité. La ville, it's the city built of stones, and the cité, it's the city built of social dynamics. And he says, Mumford was very good in building up the city of stones, the cité, and Jane Jacobs was very good in building up the city of social dynamics. And Certeau was both. He had this view from above, le voyeur, but he was mainly the voyageur, walking the small paths of the city jungle of New York and other mega cities of our world. So again, I skip and come, how many? Still 5 minutes? Okay. To come to my next distinction, it's maps and tours. And yeah, let me go back to the text. Certeau's seminar was a place for theoretically mapping the social. Ethnographic tours within the urban space were followed by distant reconstructions of these participant observations, enriched by theories from academic discourse. This theoretic mapping of social practices was tactical because it aimed to change the traditional maps of knowledge by adding the everyday practices of popular culture as new discursive authorities. And here comes into play Certeau's distinction between maps and tours. That means between everyday itineraries and academic conceptualizations. Again, I quote from the Practices of Everyday Life. In narrations, tours are dominant. Examples of tours are conditioning a map. But there are also cases in which a tour assumes the indication of a place. We thus have the structure of a travel story. Stories of journeys are marked out by the citation of the places that result from them or authorize them. Within the shift to modern academic discourse, these narrative descriptions of journeys became dominated by theoretical mappings. And I quote Certeau, "Erasure of the itineraries and their describers happened. And this also happened in theological discourse." Certeau, between the 15th and the 17th centuries, the map became autonomous. And also the map of the loci theologici, like the topography of theology, became autonomous. The map colonizes the space. It eliminates the practices that produce it. The map pushes away the operations of which it is the result or the necessary condition. It remains alone on the stage. The tour describers have disappeared. And same things can happen in theology. When we only have the maps of systematic theology and these describers and the itineraries which made it being produced disappear. And that's why we need new approaches in theology that take the everyday practices of popular culture as a new locus theologicus, as a theological authority of discourse. Like what is called in English ordinary theology or citizen theology, or in German discourse Leute-Theologie, people's or popular theology, or Alltagsdogmatik, everyday dogmatics, la sagesse du peuple, or the Idiota in Surin's letter. People, Leute, live in their everyday practices a tactical, subversive countermapping of theology. I collaborate with geographers, and they introduced to me in the practices of countermapping. And we need practices of countermapping in theology too, a kind of critical mapping, a kind of mapping back. Welcome to a synodal church. So I come to my end. It's only a short paragraph, Denkformen of Alterity, keeping the discourse open. Concluding these reflections, let me return to the beginning, where I claimed Certeau to be a hidden practical theologian. Skip. Well, as a proof for this, I mentioned the double approach of exploring both archives of mystical discourse and fields of contemporary practices. Both are, as he writes in his text on the World Trade Center, populated by wanderers. Our fellow contemporaneans, anonymous Christian mystics. In any case, they embody Certeau's characteristic difference of Christian mysticism and everyday life. His scientific curiosity that reached, I quote Louis Vuitton, from the mystics and possessed of the 17th century to the inhabitants of our new cities in 1975. And these two sides of his discourse, which describes Denis Pelletier, create different communities of reception. Louis Vuitton, each of his parts of his research, dedicated at the one time to the language of mystical texts and at the other to the art of practice of everyday life, found interest of specialists, but without seeing the deeper coherence. Nevertheless, there is unity in it. And this missing unity consists in his heterological approach. Certeau stands for an empirically rich heterology of the other in past and present discourses and practices. He calls history, psychoanalysis, and ethnography, his favorite academic disciplines, sciences of the other. Of the past as the historical other, of the unconscious as the psychological other, and of the foreign as the cultural other. All these discursive alterities of Certeau's widespread heterological work converge into a theology that is a discourse on the very other. This heterological decentration of discourse requires a dismantling of epistemic truth claims in favor of a pluralistic model of theology that reckons with a Deo semper maior, not only in spiritual practices, but also in his own epistemological core discourse, touched by the untouchable. Michel de Certeau has an attractive theoretical offer for this. I call it the 3 steps of alterity, or an alteritanian 3-step, distilled from his posthumously published theological masterpiece, La faiblesse de croire. First step, I miss the others. Il me manque. Second, nothing is possible without the others. Sont pas. Third, neither you nor I have the full truth. Ni. Academic discourse and everyday practices should be understood neither in the sense of a pre-modern either-or, nor in the sense of a post-modern both-and, but rather in the sense of a late modern or radical modern neither-nor. A double negation which keeps the Christian archives of discourse permanently open to the field of practices and the other way around. Because it is not possible without the others, not without their everyday lives, and not without a critical distance. Nothing more is needed for doing good practical theology. Thanks for your attention.